Hey guys, Miss Green here. Today I'm going to be talking about Detente in 10. So basically, Detente, overall, it was a policy of reducing Cold War tensions to avoid conflict, and this was between the USSR and the US. Détente was a French word that meant relaxation of tension. It lasted from 1968 to 1969, although signs of it were apparent in 1968. Certainly, by the late 1960s, both the US and the USSR came to desire an improvement in the Cold War relationships. This was for a variety of reasons. This period was usually seen as ending in 1979 and 1980, but in general, it was a more complex set of international relations which covered attempts to reduce tensions and increase cooperations between the USSR and the USA. Both the US and the USSR stood to gain if trade could be increased and the danger of nuclear warfare reduced. In addition, Nixon, a candidate for re-election, was under fire at home for those demanding social change, racial equality, and an end to the Vietnam War. The trip to Russia, like his historic trip to China a few months earlier, permitted him to keep public attention focused on his foreign policy achievements rather than his domestic problems. Nixon's trip to China had also heightened the Soviets' interest in detente, given the growing antagonism between Russia and China. Detente and the USSR. At the time, there were three main factors that were driving the Soviet Union to seek a better relationship with the US. First, there was a compelling economic reason. By 1969, the Soviet economy was beginning to show signs of stagnating, and this was partly due to the bureaucratic insufficiency, but it was also because of the heavy burden of defense spending required too much U.S. military developments. This situation grew in the 1970s as Soviets were spending both on defense and aid to developing world countries, and that was very much increased. Their leader had ignored signs of economic decline, and he wished to import new technology as there was more advanced Western economies and trade was being increased. Nixon and Kissinger played down the role of ideology in foreign affairs, and they were prepared to be more relaxed about military matters. They believed in nuclear sufficiency, but they didn't see it as a superiority, but it should be a main aim. However, detente was really an attempt to create a more modern version of containment. The US still wanted to limit Soviet power, while the USSR saw detente as a way to consolidate an European position. Nonetheless, detente was a significant development and achieved its greatest successes in the early 1970s. Essentially, Nixon and Kissinger abandoned the policy of rolling back communism in favor of the policy of detente and linkage.
Detente ended in 1980 after the USSR invaded Afghanistan. This invasion prompted President Jimmy Carter to recall a nuclear weapons peace treaty, which was the beginning of a more aggressive foreign policy towards Russia. This invasion caused Carter to end detente because the USSR was attempting to control Afghanistan, which gave them a chance to take over neighboring countries such as Pakistan and Iran in the future. This invasion forced the US to take action against the Soviets for three reasons. 1. These Middle Eastern countries didn't want communism, and the US felt the need to protect them. 2. The domino effect. If these three nations fell, communism would soon be spread to Pakistan and Iran's neighboring nations. These three countries are home to the majority of oil resources, meaning the Soviets would control oil trade. To take anti-war steps away from peace, the U.S. denied exports of grain and technology to the Soviets, boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and sent $2 billion to aid anti-communist fighters in Afghanistan. Though this did help the cause, this money and power gave way to the rise of the Taliban and Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda. Aggressive foreign policy was implemented even further when Ronald Reagan became president, which led to our victory in the nuclear arms race. This is a picture of anti-communist fighters in Afghanistan, which were they were provided weapons and money by the U.S. The breakthrough of Cold War conflict and the beginning of détente began when China and the Soviets began to conflict. This conflict came from their supposed alliance during the Korean War and World War II. Stalin didn't defend Mao Zedong against the nationalists during World War II, and he forced China to pay for their weapons during the Korean War in cash, which resulted in the USSR withdrawing their support in China's nuclear program. They had a falling out involving their militaries in the late 1960s, which caught Washington's eye. The U.S. wanted to make peace with the fighting nations, beginning with China, by ending their trade embargo, which had been in place for years. Nixon attempted to make peace with the Russians through Vietnamization, which was the term Nixon used when removing U.S. troops in Vietnam, which settled conflict between the U.S. and the Soviets. This is a picture of Red Army soldiers during the 1969 conflict between China and Russia at the Ussuri River, which was the previously discussed falling out between the Allies, which allowed for détente to materialize.